Alrighty, so hello and thank you for joining us today for our Firewise Landscaping 101 webinar. My name is Madeline Wood. I'm the Water Conservation Analyst with the City of Santa Barbara. And this webinar is a great collaborative effort between UC Santa Barbara, the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, and the City of Santa Barbara Water Resources Division and Fire Department. So you'll see us on the panel today who are available for questions in the Q&A portion. And today the presentation will be about 45 minutes long. We'd be happy to address questions after the presentation, but you can ask your question at any time by entering it into the Q&A portion in Zoom. You'll see it at the bottom, and you can just type your question in at any time and we'll answer it at the end of the presentation. We are recording this and we will be publishing it to our website in a couple days, and we'll also be emailing out the recording to everyone who registered, and that's usually within a couple days. And for now, I would like to introduce our instructor for today, which is Christina Faust. Christina is a fifth-year PhD student in the Department of Geography at UC Santa Barbara. Her research focuses on identifying critical fire conditions from the leaf to the landscape scale. She manages the UCSB Wildfire Research Initiative's plant flammability laboratory work under the advising of Max Moritz. Welcome, Christina.
Thank you. So if we are ready to go ahead, we can just kind of move into the outline.
Let's go for it.
Sweet. So today we're going to go over first fire risk zones, and then look at Firewise landscaping principles. So things that are important to think about in managing or building a garden in a fire zone. Best management practices for Firewise landscaping, zoning your garden, so looking at defensible space, flammability research, and then we'll have some time for a Q&A. So again, the first thing we're going to look at are these fire risk zones. It is really important if you live in this area to know the risk zone for your home and property. So again, fire hazard is going to be this combination of landscape flammability and housing density. So we're looking at areas that are in or blending into kind of native vegetation, but also areas that are maybe at risk of encroachment of wildfire from native vegetation and severe fire weather. So we've just got a couple maps for you guys. The first one is the county map. So you can see we took a little inset of Santa Barbara City from the Santa Barbara County map. So if you are outside the city, you can actually go look at where your home might fall in the county with respect to fire hazard. But moving on to the city map, we actually have very, very detailed fire hazard maps for Santa Barbara City. And why this is important is it's obviously really important to know your risk, but there's also different requirements for defensible space and different recommendations. And again, you guys are always welcome to contact the Santa Barbara City Fire Department if you have any questions about this. So looking at Firewise principles, there are a few key things we really want to highlight that are important to think about when managing a property or building a garden in a fire hazard zone. And generally, if you live in Santa Barbara, it's a good idea to kind of think about these things. So the first one is that no plants are fireproof. Plants are all made of material that will burn under the right conditions. So again, no plants are fireproof. The second one is we're thinking now that it's important for people to think about maintenance and plant selection. So what plants can you maintain on your property to minimize their fire hazard? The third one is placement is key. So we have all of these great guidelines around defensible space, and we're getting clearer guidelines on how to plant and how to maintain in different defensible space zones to protect your structures. And then the last one, again, zoning and spacing. We really want to emphasize thinking about slope. So a lot of people don't realize your defensible space zones can change a little bit depending on whether or not your property's on a slope or an extreme slope. That can extend the amount of land you may want to think about. So we have a few graphics for you there on that. So first one, moving into no plants are fireproof. Again, under the right conditions, all plants will burn. But if you think about placement and maintenance, you can have a beautiful native garden that will support native plants and wildlife. So with this idea that no plants are fireproof, we also want to think about fundamentally just to prep you to think through kind of the science behind this before we really start thinking about the garden. We want to build a base of understanding in what affects plant flammability. So there are kind of three key things that like we look at on the scientific side that we know kind of drives flammability of vegetation. And the first one that a lot of people are really familiar with out here is just moisture content. So mechanically speaking, the more water is in a plant, the harder it is for that plant to burn, and the less energy or less rapid energy that plant's going to release when it's on fire. That being said, there are things you need to think about with watering out here, which we'll get into a little bit, but mechanically, more moisture in the plant doesn't burn as much. So the next thing is chemical composition. And this gets into a little bit of like the physiology. So there are some plants that do weird things with their chemical composition and moisture content. So it gets a little complicated. But generally, if we just go back to kind of the physical understanding, some plants are rich in flammable oils. And those plants, while they may be very beautiful and important for kind of the natural environment, may not be the best thing to have really close to your house. So that's where we can really think about like maintenance, placement, size control of that vegetation, so biomass control. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later too. So some plants are rich in flammable oils. Those plants are generally going to light on fire faster and burn with higher intensity. And then some plants, and we've seen this with also a bunch of our native species, have less flammable material. So it is possible for the chemical structure of that plant to just have less stuff in it that burns. So carbon burns versus there are these things called silicates. They're like a chemical structure that just doesn't burn very well. And some of our native species like store those. So the last thing we also want to look at is this idea of plant structure and growth form. So this is another really obvious one that people probably think about all the time. And that is, does the plant maintain dead material? How big does it get? How fast does it grow? Will you be able to get out there and trim it every once in a while? So looking at this idea of, a tree has a very different growth form than a daisy. And those, it may be really obvious, but that's going to kind of affect where you want to put those plants or prioritize maintenance on those plants. Scientifically, we look at stuff like leaf size and density and branch arrangement, which is really just to say how fluffy is it, and how much air can get in there and support the fire and that kind of thing. So again, three things you want to think about with no plants are fireproof, but there is some stuff about those plants that's going to affect how quickly they burn, how quickly they ignite, and then how intensely they burn. So important to remember. So the next thing, kind of following from that idea of no plants are fireproof, is you want to think about maintenance and plant selection and maintenance and prioritizing what you're doing on your property. So say you're kind of thinking about you want to bring in some new plants onto your property, you want to rework your garden, you want to think about what vegetation can you reasonably maintain. So there are some species that can be maintained in a way that keeps them very managed and safer, but if that means you're going to have to be out there raking, trimming, multiple times a year, you may even need to rake like weekly for some of these guys. You need to think about kind of what can you reasonably do, or if you have gardeners, are you going to be able to have people out there with the right frequency to maintain this plant for minimal flammability? And then some plants need more or less maintenance or different kinds of maintenance. And the next thing is kind of thinking about placement is key. With respect to maintenance, is your plant accessible for maintenance? So this really makes sense out here where we have these really intense slopes sometimes. It may not be a good idea to put a high maintenance plant on a difficult to access slope, because someone's going to have to get out there and take care of that plant or remove dead material or something pretty frequently. So you may want to choose something else. And then are your plants distance from each other in structures? So we have a lot of cool figures for you guys with the zoning. But yeah, if it's a fast growing plant on a steep slope, is someone going to be out there to trim it as often as they need to be? And then on the other side of that, we need to think about watering a lot in Santa Barbara. And our native species, again, the folks at the Botanic Garden have a lot of expertise on this. Some native species do not like being watered through the summer, and that you need to kind of think about timing of this watering and strategies for watering that are going to maximize uptake and keep that plant happy with kind of, working around our drought restrictions too. So select plants that cope well with our seasonal drought or are drought deciduous, and if they are drought deciduous, make sure you can get out there and rake to keep that kind of litter under control. So more stuff on plant maintenance. Again, timing and physical maintenance. Thinking about this drought deciduousness, this is kind of an interesting thing to think about with some of our native species. If that species is not maintaining aerial fuels, which means when it gets drought stressed, it goes and drops all its leaves. There's less aerial fuels maintained in that shrub to burn. So this is something that we need kind of more research on to see how that affects its flammability. But we think, maybe these guys are going to burn with less intensity just because they decrease their own biomass. They drop material when they get dry, but then you need to go in and remove that dropped material to maybe get the benefit of that. So again, we just want to get you guys thinking about creative approaches here to minimize fire risk on your property. Yeah, and then turn back on a growth cycle appropriate to the plant. Again, the Botanic Garden has some great expertise and resources on that. All right, so now we're actually going to show kind of zone by zone what this might look like on a flat property. So we'll show you what it looks like on a slope property, but right now, assume this is flat. We're going to explore building a garden from these zones. And again, CAL FIRE defines 3 zones. So on a flat property in a standard fire hazard zone, zone 0 is this important and new zone that goes 0 to 5 feet from the structure as of January 1st, 2023. We have some more details on kind of what's required in zone 0. Then zone 1 is from the edge of zone 0 out to 30 feet. Zone 2 is 30 to 100 feet, and these again are the minimum distance that you want to protect around your home. So zone 0 is termed this ember resistance zone. So this is stuff where in a windy condition, you may get embers trying to pile up against your home. And if there is less there that the embers can catch, that improves the chance of the home surviving the fire. So you need to make sure essentially that there's nothing that can burn in zone 0. And we really want to emphasize home hardening. So all those cool little pieces of technology and stuff that we have now, ember screens, siding, that won't burn. So everything you can do that will prevent fire from catching near the structure, near the base of the structure. So no debris, no dead plant material, and hardscape only in this zone. So zone 1, and remember zone 0 only goes out to 5 feet. Zone 1 is more like your clean, minimal garden zone. So again, no dead plant material, and you're going to be very actively maintaining any vegetation that exists in this zone. So trim plants, sweep leaves and debris, tree spacing, if there are trees in or around this zone, is critical. Tree branches need to be greater than 10 feet from other tree branches. And I believe also structures, but we have a couple more slides on that. Separation between vegetation and furniture is also very important. So spacing, keep this zone super clean. Zone 2 is your fuel reduction. So this is 30 to 100 feet. That's quite a big area. This is where, and it's 30 to 100 feet from structures and decks. So if I can point out again in this figure, you have the home, which is kind of the square on the right, and then we're assuming a deck and maybe a parking area on the left. So these zones extend from kind of the outest boundary of that structure. So this zone, there may be grass present. It needs to be mowed to less than 4 inches. There may be fallen debris present, and that needs to be maintained to less than 3 inches. And again, spacing is still really critical in this zone. So now we have a couple cool graphics that is going to demonstrate what you need to do if your home is on a slope. So notice that these zone requirements are actually kind of like they're along the flat, they're along the horizontal. So it's going to be tricky to maybe think about exactly the area that, say, you were to take a tape measure and walk along the ground away from your home. Again, rely on the fire department, they're very helpful. But this is just kind of to emphasize, if you have a vegetation or property that extends far downslope from your structure, you're going to need to protect more of that property than if your home was on a flat surface. And I believe these figures will be available to you guys later too. So these are the actual guidelines for tree spacing on slopes. So this is also just to emphasize that not only do you need to protect more property, these spacing requirements for vegetation within those zones also changes and increases with slope. So I'm actually going to hop back to this previous slide. Notice that when moving up slope, fire actually behaves in kind of a weird way, where it kind of moves up the slope, which is why you need to protect kind of more property and have to think about overhanging branches in those areas. So flat slope, you've got like a 10-foot spacing. Flat to mild slope, mild to moderate, that's going to be a lot of properties in Santa Barbara. That's up to about 40% slope. You want about 20-foot spacing between trees, and then extreme slope, you want about 30-foot spacing between trees. Shrubs, instead of being a set foot distance like we have for trees, shrubs are actually going to look at the height of the shrub. Out here we have shrubs that can be really small up to things that are almost the size of trees. So for a flat slope, you need a distance that is 2 times the height of the shrub in between the shrubs. Mild to moderate is 4 times. Steep, it is 6 times the height of the shrub. And again, we put some links in here so that you can go look up kind of the specific requirements for your property. So this will bring us in now to best management practices. A cool way to think about these things is they are specific packaged strategies, ideas, things that you do, or things that you can put outside on your property but they are like kind of complete ideas or things that you can implement that will reduce your fire risk, bring in biodiversity, and generally just kind of supplement your garden. So we're going to highlight a few of these things as we go through our kind of demo garden zone by zone through the defensible space. And again, they could be like a recurrent activity or a tool or feature that you put in place in your garden. So we have one more slide to kind of get at this idea. Some people may recognize the word bioswale. BMPs can also be compost basins, downed logs in appropriate placement, gray water reuse, and things you really need to think about with putting kind of these special things on your property is that they can improve resilience from wildfire, provide native habitat, reduce water usage. Ideally, they cover a couple of these at the same time. But most importantly, BMPs require maintenance to work effectively. You can imagine how if you implement a down log, you're going to need to think about where that goes, and you'll probably need to manage vegetation around it to have it both promote wildlife, but also to manage the wildfire hazard. So BMPs work differently in different parts of your garden and different locations relative to your home. So some of these things are more effective in different zones. So now we're kind of at the fun part. We've got some very nice little images and ideas for BMPs going zone by zone through a demonstration garden. So the idea here is, how would you build a Waterwise and Firewise garden starting from scratch? And we know for a lot of people that that's maybe not incredibly realistic, but we want to give you kind of ideas of, say you have an established garden, what are things that you could do or implement that would bolster that garden's water-wise properties, Firewise properties, and native habitat. So zone 0, again, is this ember resistance zone. And perhaps like the key takeaway here is it is only 5 feet from your property. And it's going to be important to be very, very protective of this zone. The heat accumulation that occurs inside ember piles, so windblown embers can pile up against things, is ridiculous. So those kind of ember accumulations can be really, really dangerous to the home. So it's very important here to maintain hardscape surfacing only, no dead plants or materials. If there are plants, they must be minimal, small herbaceous plants. Container gardens are okay, but they're going to need to be, very managed, well maintained, small vegetation. So, an herb pot would probably be fine in this zone, but you don't want, a large bank of herbs. Okay, so home hardening. This is also really important. We're thinking about the garden, but it's always good to remember, are your siding and roof fire resistant? And have you taken ember blocking measures, so ember screens? Again, the fire department and the fire safe council can provide a lot of input there. And again, this may be a little new for some people too, but no wood or rubber mulches in this zone. So now we have some design ideas and maintenance ideas for you. Remember, it's only 5 feet. So plant selection, we're going to say avoid ground planting in this zone. Container gardens may be used, but must be small and able to relocate. So in the event of extreme fire weather, you can move things out of this zone. But generally, everything in here you want small and non-flammable. For your container gardens, consider California native cacti. Cactus are awesome, and there are a lot of very beautiful California natives that you can incorporate here. All items in this zone should be non-flammable. Hardscape recommendations, you can consider hardscapes that are built to mimic natural substrates. So a variety of sizes of substrate from boulders to sand, but do not select substrates that you will struggle to sweep and clear of debris. So say you want to put a boulder for lizards or something in this zone, you still need to sweep around it and make sure that whatever hardscape you're using is not accumulating dead material. So watering, you want to water your potted plants. Maintenance schedule, you need very regular debris removal, especially during the fire season. And again, trim all of the overhanging branches. No branches within 10 feet, so that's even wider than this zone 0. So no branches within 10 feet of stovepipe chimney structure. So here are a couple BMPs that can be recommended for this zone. We can have some fun water features in this area. So you could do a rain chain, some puddling for wildlife, but again, nothing that's gonna, trap debris. BMP2, we're using this idea of happy hardscapes. This little image on the right is actually it's a lizard habitat. So it's just a little stack of tiles with gravel in between. So that is non-flammable. You may not want that right up against the structure, but it is a cool way to incorporate habitat in an otherwise kind of dead space. And again, no trapping debris. Home hardening, again, those ember screens, shutters, flame resistant exterior surfaces. A lot of people are familiar with that by now. The other thing we wanted to give ideas for is non-flammable decor. So it's something a lot of people overlook is you want to make sure your deck furniture is not a fire hazard. So choosing materials like metal will mean that that furniture can't burn in the event of a fire. All right, so moving on to zone 1. Now we're getting into a little more of like a garden. So same idea here, no dead plant material. Really emphasize clearance. And then you want irrigation and soil focus to plant to save water. So in this area, you need good spacing between vegetation, and you really want to focus on the soil to create a rich natural soil environment that's going to like hold that water like a sponge. And again, the Botanic Garden has some great resources on how to build and develop healthy soil. And there's some really cool stuff with how that soil interacts with native species too. So, watering plan, here it's important to think about efficiency. So choose appropriate hyper-efficient watering systems for your plant species. And gray water reuse is also appropriate in this zone. So we're thinking about how can we most efficiently maintain the most healthy, well-spaced, low-growing vegetation 5 to 30 feet from the home. Your maintenance schedule, especially before and throughout the fire season, that's really when you want to pay attention to this zone. There's going to need to be probably weekly or monthly cleaning for dead material out here. So no dead material permitted on plants or on the ground. Trimming, same thing, 10-foot clearance. So zone 1 sample planting plan. Again, these native California succulents are really, really fun. You can also think about wildflowers with good spacing in this zone. We were looking at a California daisy that would be really nice here. So looking at picking vegetation that has properties where, those plants are going to be generally smaller. They're going to stay healthy and hydrated with little water, small and slow growing. So that'll be a decision for the homeowner too. Whether or not you can maintain those plants or whether or not the people who maintain the property can maintain those plants. Otherwise, like choosing things that are really slow growing is a good idea. You want plants that don't hold or produce dead material. So some species going through our natural drought just have branches die and they have dead fuel that they just kind of hold around. We do not want those plants 5 to 30 feet from the home. So then also consider drought deciduous. So there are some native vegetation out here that have beautiful kind of green leaves through the rainy season and then drop them. And if you're comfortable going out there and picking up after those plants, they may be a good choice in this zone, but you want to keep things generally small. And we do most of the vegetation in here, we want to be non-woody. So, yep, and then trim thin existing trees and remove unwanted volunteer plants. So that's also something we come up with a lot in native chaparral. You're going to have plants that are just going to grow up on your property. This is still in that zone where you want to look at those guys and, remove them if they're not things that are going to fit well into the Firewise planning. So here are a couple species that you could think about incorporating into this zone. And notice that we have these kind of set beds with good spacing and boulder habitat in between them. So there are plenty of ways you could do this, but this is an example of a very cool kind of native garden setup. For a lot of people, maybe this is like manicured pavers in between garden beds, or gravel. But here we kind of are looking at like the yucca is an option. California native grape is generally small when maintained and herbaceous with the woody stems, but you can keep it manicured. Flowers, wildflowers, and some grass. So here are some BMPs that are cool for Zone 0. People may be familiar with this laundry to landscape. We kind of paired this idea with gray water reuse into mulch basins. So there may be mulch in this zone, and if you maintain that mulch in a way that keeps that soil nice and healthy, it can support more lush and healthy vegetation. So think about how you can do that while minimizing water usage. So Zone 2, this is 30 to 100 feet. This is your fuels reduction zone. So you may have a lot of like native volunteer plants in this zone. You may also be familiar with ladder fuels. So this is going to be some combination of probably managing native vegetation that grows on your property to reduce ladder fuels. And then for some people, it may also be choosing kind of vegetation that you're planting to maintain this like large lush garden. But again, we want to maintain spacing, and we need to, again, always kind of think about minimizing that dead material and think about slope. This tends to be where people's properties also get very slopey. So Zone 2 sample planting plan. Plant selection in this zone, you want to think about how can your vegetation support native wildlife. We're moving farther away from the structure. Now we're looking at flowers, seeds, berries, boulders, and wildflowers. And these things can be, a little more kind of blending naturally together. So you're looking for vegetation that, again, stays healthy and hydrated with little water. Same idea, drought deciduous natives, but you'll want to make sure that you can maintain that litter depth to what's specified, and remove any volunteer plants that you don't want. So here are some plants that might work well in this zone. The coastal live oak is very popular, and you'll often just find them in this area. The western redbud is a great example of a tree that kind of maintains minimal leaf structure. So it's very like airy. It doesn't have a lot of biomass naturally. Coyote brush. And again, think about always kind of keeping these things trimmed and separated and healthy. So this is our Firewise habitat BMPs. We're looking at bird or bat boxes now. So ways to incorporate habitat, shelter, and resources for wildlife. You could place a single down log or intentional snags that you maintain vegetation around, and that will create kind of compact environments that will support native animals and wildlife. But again, always kind of thinking about maintenance around these things. You can also build structures that incorporate non-flammable porous materials such as brick and pipe. So if you look up, I think they're like, bee houses and things like that. You can find these cool structures that people are building that incorporate natural and stone and brick materials that create wildlife habitat. And then also this beautiful underground snake sedge. So this is awesome because it incorporates all of these kind of natural materials, but it's mostly underground and protected. So here are a couple more. This is a great zone for bioswales. So these are kind of divots in the ground that are going to direct rainwater runoff into capture basins. So they're places that's going to grab and direct water, because when we get rain, we tend to get a lot of rain here, and then funnel it into areas that you want infiltration. So this would be like a little, it would be a pond when it's raining, but other times it would probably just look kind of like a gravel basin or a mulch basin with some higher water native vegetation. So some beautiful images of that here. So that has taken us through our demo garden, and I can see we're kind of coming up on time. So the last thing that we're going to go through is this testing plant flammability. So this is the work that I'm most involved in. We run a plant flammability lab at UC Santa Barbara, where we actually sample and burn native vegetation across the Santa Barbara wildland communities. So I'm just going to take some time to walk through what we're doing and what we've found so far. But keep in mind that all of this work is not yet published. So it may change a little bit kind of from here on out, but we are very actively involved in community outreach. So there will be more opportunities to kind of see this work as it evolves. So this is kind of what we're doing. We're looking at how plant traits affect their flammability. So this is everything from the plant's fuel moisture to the leaf size to how it, is affected by our summer drought. And we're curious about if we can tease out how those specific traits influence different ways that the plant burns. So there are a few key ways that plants kind of go through the combustion process. We generally look at how easy is it to light plant on fire. That would be ignitability, but we also look at how intensely the plant burns and how long the plant burns. And you can imagine that between those three things, how easy is it to light on fire, how hard does it burn, and how long does it burn, those can really be important to determine how you want to maintain that plant, how you want to water it, and then where you want that plant on your property. So there's this cool picture up in the right-hand side. That's a few of our interns out sampling around Painted Cave. And then the bottom left is actually our combustion setup. And last year we were testing only greenhouse species, so it was like a pilot study. The data that you're seeing is from that small pilot study, but by next year we'll have some very cool data looking at plant flammability all the way through our summer drought. Generally what we're seeing is fuel moisture and sample mass are really important to plant flammability, burn intensity, burn duration. So that really emphasizes the point of controlling biomass and then making sure your plants are healthy. So we have a short video for you guys. This was one white sage sample that we burned last summer. We're working with the Botanic Garden to get kind of more of this media out to the public. So keep an eye out for that. The video quality on this is terrible, but it gives you an idea of what our kind of scientific setup looks like. So you can see the way that these ignite is we have it over these really hot plate surfaces, and that kind of, it gets parts of the plant to essentially evaporate. And then when those volatile, flammable vapors leave the plant from that heat, they may intersect something we call like a pilot flame or a pilot ignition. And you can see it happen right there, where there's like a little bit of smoke, and then it hits the pilot flame, and that's what ignites the sample. So we're trying to replicate this situation of like wildfire ignition. And then we measure a whole bunch of different metrics about how these guys burn. And again, our ultimate goal here is to make kind of a comparison and science-backed recommendations for prioritizing planting and plant maintenance. So we'll see if it'll jump over a couple issues. There we go. So the other thing that we did with this that some of you may have seen is we ran a community survey. And we're interested in both plant flammability, but also what people value about their vegetation. And that could even be used to kind of make recommendations on a new species or, native species that would fit really well into this landscape. Plants that do a lot for people and the natural world, and plants that also don't burn very well. That's kind of our goal here. So it seems like Santa Barbara residents really value their vegetation for privacy, beauty, and for some people, home gardening. So we're looking a lot at plants that fit kind of those things too. And a lot of people are looking for drought tolerant vegetation. So we're trying to find kind of species that fit those well. And this is our most recent results. So just to kind of unpack this here, on the bottom, so the x-axis, left to right, we're seeing how well does this plant fit what people like. So, and notice here that all of these scores that we found are pretty high. These are all native species. They all do a lot for the natural environment. They're really pretty. Some of them are edible. So they fit really well. None of these are bad. They're all actually really, really good for fitting what people want in their vegetation. Then on the top to bottom, so bottom would be the least flammable, and moving up you see the most flammable. So left to right you have increasing desirability, bottom to top you see increasing flammability. So right now this is still pretty preliminary. We don't want to make a lot of judgments on any of these plants right now. What we are trying to do is come up with a compact rating system that we could put on plant tags or work with to kind of communicate more broadly how these things burn, how you might want to use them, what zone they're the most appropriate in, and then kind of give you guys more concrete recommendations there. And then we have a whole bunch of resources for folks to, look more at this stuff. Defensible space evaluations are incredible. You can get someone to come out and look at your property for free and give you advice based off a lot of this stuff. Chipping services, vegetation management information, and then a couple other things for people to think about vegetation. Oh, I should also mention there is a Firescape demonstration garden that is underutilized. So go check that out. It's very pretty. So now I think we're on to the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Christina. Thank you for that presentation and going through zone by zone. And just a note with the Firescape garden, like Christina said, that's a great resource. A lot of folks walk their dogs through there. It's a really peaceful garden. There are zones there, but this is built pre-January 1, 2023, when we now have this new zone 0. So some of the zones are going to be a little bit different, so just keep that in mind. More information is always coming and things are always changing, but a lot of the same principles are the same. All right, so we have the Q&A bubbles down below. Please feel free to type in any of your questions, and we have this panel that can answer them, and we'd be happy to take them. I know one thing we were talking about before the presentation started was palm trees. They're very common. They're also a very common volunteer. I know from the Firescape Garden and working with the maintaining that garden, they just crop up and you have to rip them out before they get too big and they start getting those deep roots. So I just wanted to ask, anyone on the panel who wants to chime in terms of recommendations for how to maintain palm trees so that they're less flammable, and then also is the current planting requirements to try to stay away from palm trees. If there's anything Christina or Chris you want to chime in on with palm trees while we have questions come in.
Yeah, so you kind of nailed it. Don't most palms are not allowed as far as planting. Obviously, the city of Santa Barbara, we have a lot of palm trees. It was the California Kings and Queen palms were a very commonly planted species. If you do have one on your property, making sure that you're just removing dead palm fronds as much as possible. Sometimes that's a little hard. Just especially with the California Kings, they get so tall, it's a bit of a maintenance nightmare. But just getting rid of the dead palm fronds. My kind of rule of thumb is once they start getting perpendicular to the stem, so basically once they're more than 90 degrees and they start dipping below, that's a good time to remove the palm fronds. And then also kind of just cleaning out as much of the dead kind of in the husk as you can. So again, there's just a lot of places for embers to land in the crowns of palm trees that ends up kind of creating a problem where the palm fronds actually release from the tree when they're burning and they can sail. We found, burnt palm fronds down on the beach during the Jesuita and the tea fire. So they really, really can travel a very far distance after they've ignited.
Great. Thank you, Chris. So we've got a question about artificial turf. We've been talking about how zone 0 is very few plants, if not any plants, and mostly talking about hardscaping or rockscaping. But what is artificial turf in the terms of fire safety and danger?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So most artificial turf isn't what we call Class A rated. So it doesn't have, it can burn anything that's petroleum based. So if it's oil based, things like even lawn furniture, anything that's plastic can and will burn. It won't give off large flame lengths, like if you had live grass, but it will smolder. So again, if you have it right up next to the structure, I wouldn't recommend it within that 0 zone. So that 0 to 5 foot zone, I would probably keep clear, making sure it's hardscape. But again, from the maintenance standpoint, if you have, artificial turf, if you've replaced your lawn, that's okay. We generally don't have a problem with that.
Okay, thank you. So we've got some questions about slopes. So specifically on a slope, comparison of manzanita versus sage in terms of what you're seeing, Christina, in the lab with the combustibility and the flammability of manzanita and sage.
Yeah, for this one, I can actually talk a little bit more about what we're doing now too. And I think Scott may have more with the slope stabilization.
So
So
there's a second question,
yeah.
and it would be good to touch on both of them. So stabilizing the slope with natives, if sage is still a recommendation, if there's other items to consider in terms of different plant species for that.
Yeah, for the sage, what we're seeing is across the board, sage really likes to ignite. Relative to its biomass, it's also fairly combustible, but it's a very, very important and incredible native species for supporting insects. It also smells awesome. It's a very cool plant. I think what we were kind of talking about earlier was looking at like sage in moderation and in kind of sensible placement. You may not want it close to your home, but it's also it's such an important plant. It doesn't really make sense to remove it. But you may not want sage directly underneath overhanging branches. You may want it kind of more isolated, and then it's a plant you'll want to maintain and not let it get too big. So in farther out zones, it could be a great plant for slope stabilization. That's something I've heard too. I don't know if it does anything particularly cool with the soil, but I was hoping that Scott might be able to talk about that a bit. We're also testing things like we're testing toyon, laurel sumac, and lemonade berry in this round through the summer drought. And we are seeing fairly interesting differences right now between those three. But I can't really comment too much on it because a lot of that data we won't get until we actually process like our heat flux data and our temperature data. But I can say now that like the lemonade berry doesn't really like to light on fire. Toyon does like to light on fire, but we don't really know how they compare with like fire intensity. So, and toyon wasn't liking, like we couldn't light the toyon when the toyon was had higher fuel moisture. So there's like very interesting complex comparisons there too that we really need to get into before we like release data on those. But yeah, the hill slope stabilization I'm also very curious about.
So Scott, do you have any recommendations for some native plants that will do a better job stabilizing on slopes?
Yeah, well, I have some thoughts, and I wonder if, you know, Christina can chime in on this, because one of the things you mentioned, Christina, is that structure is really important for flammability. And one of the things that we often recommend for slopes is actually more of the creeping types of plants. So as opposed to like an upright Salvia mellifera, there are a number of creeping and trailing sages. And I wonder, Christina, first off, if you have any thoughts about how that structural change of selecting a plant that's lower to the ground, that's going to be growing and impact based on what you've seen.
Yeah, definitely. So that that probably gets into this idea of like biomass control. So some of these sages like to grow in like big mounds. So they accumulate a lot of biomass. So the more biomass there is, the larger flame height we see. And the taller the plant is, the higher the flames can get. So that if you measure from the top of the plant, then you have more mass and you have a taller plant. So if you're using a creeping sage with tiny leaves, that was another thing we saw. The white sage has this big, thick leaf. The other types of sage, we tested a purple sage that still grows in kind of like a mound. But the smaller leaves, the decreased biomass, it just had smaller flame heights mechanically. So there may be sages that store less volatiles. There may also be structural components that can make it so that you don't have to worry so much about what's over top of them. So yeah, there's a lot to kind of consider with that.
Yeah, so with that in mind, I mean, there are a number of creeping sages if you're really wed to a sage. One that is a cultivar or a selection of the purple sage, Salvia leucophylla, is in single quotes like Point Sal, the Point Sal spreader, is kind of a creeping sage. But there's some great creeping manzanitas like Emerald Carpet. There are also some creeping ceanothus like the Yankee Point. And then I forget, Christina, in your data, if Artemisia californica, the California sagebrush, was problematic, but there is a Santa Barbara Botanic Garden introduction, the Canyon Gray Artemisia californica, which again grows lower. It's more of a trailing plant than one of the more upright and kind of massive straight species that you might find. So particularly for slope stabilization, the lower creeping plants are kind of preferred, because what you want to do to stabilize the slope is you want more interception of the rainfall that could create the erosive effect on the soil. So having the low plants to intercept a lot of that rainfall, reduce the water's energy before it hits the soil, and spreading plants are going to be effective at that. Does that answer the questions a little bit?
Yeah, I think that sounds great. So, you know, what's going to hold on to that slope more? And that's a good point in terms of the shrub. We're talking about shrubs and taller shrubs, but if you can look at more of a ground cover level, and that means there's less of that biomass. So speaking of a ground cover. What about rosemary? Is that something that you've tested, Christina? Because that is a ground cover. It's, aromatic, and that's something that some folks do use to stabilize slopes. We've got a question about how flammable rosemary might be.
Yeah, so we have not tested rosemary yet. I'm not actually sure if there are native rosemaries, but so far with the limited resources, we've prioritized testing the natives. With more resources, more time, funding, we're hoping to test a very broad range of things, and compare kind of across native species to invasive or commonly planted ornamentals that are not native. So yeah, we want to test rosemary. We also would like to test juniper as a baseline. But generally we've not tested juniper, though it's like colloquially very flammable. Let me think. Ceanothus was surprising because while it's like colloquially flammable, we have a very hard time getting it to ignite in our methods. So by our combustion chamber, just the way we set it up, we think the ceanothus is not very ignitable under those scenarios. Exposed to an open flame, it's a very different story. But yeah, and then looking at the flame intensity, we still have to pull the data on that. So yeah, I would say some of the biggest surprises we've seen is we get few ignitions, or so far we've had few ignitions on Ceanothus griseus. We've had practically none. Megacarpus, we have few. And then oddly enough, laurel sumac, we have few ignitions on right now. I can say that we have not gotten into the worst part of the drought yet, so that may change as these species get more droughted. So I want to kind of be hesitant to say too much here, but keep an eye out for that in 6 months or so. We'll have that data.
We did have a wonderful rain year. That's true. Everything got delayed a little bit.
Yeah, it's wild.
So Chris, this might be a question for you. Do you know anything about fire insurance rate reductions based on home fire mitigation practices?
Yeah, and can you guys hear me okay? I lost video. I'm not sure why, but
yeah,
okay,
we can hear you just fine.
So it's a pretty complex question. Insurance is really kind of the big thing right now as far as people being dropped because they, their insurance companies have either pulled out of the market or they're no longer renewing. Firewise community. So if you're in a high fire hazard area, talk to your neighbors potentially about starting a Firewise community. We have, I believe, 4 now within the city, and I think county has over a dozen, or they're coming up on that number. That designation as a Firewise community, some insurance companies are offering rate reductions, but it's, again, insurance companies really want kind of as much as you can do around the structure and the property in and of itself. We always say, as many tools as you can add in your toolkit. So defensible space clearing, again, 80% of structural loss and wildfires is from ember intrusion, either into the structure itself through vents and crawl spaces, embers getting in gutters, or in that zone 0, things like mulch up against the side of the home. I've seen a lot of insurance companies really kind of going after that, trees close to the structure, things like that. So if your insurance company sent you a letter or they're talking about not renewing your policy, again, if you're within the city, if you're in a high fire hazard area, contact us. We'll come out, give you, our guidance, and hopefully the insurance companies will be receptive to that. But yeah, it's a big issue right now. I get at least 2 or 3 phone calls a month from people that are getting dropped and they don't know what to do. The Insurance Commissioner of California's website also has some really good resources and materials. The California Fair Plan is kind of the fallback option. So if you can't find carriers, the California Fair Plan can supplement your insurance for the home itself. So you can always use the California Fair Plan. You cannot be denied through that insurance option. It's not the best, again, kind of a fallback thing. But yeah, Firewise communities and just kind of being as proactive as you can with defensible space.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. All right. Well, that takes us to 1 o'clock. Thank you, everyone. Like I said, we will be sending out this recording as well as some of those resources that we've talked about. That will come in an email from me. I expect that possibly on Friday. Thank you so much, Christina and Scott and Chris, for your time. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.